The frontier market lay drowned in shadow, lit only by the flickering torches that spat orange into the night. Widow Jane stood silent, 3 children clinging to her skirt like they feared the wind might carry them off. "Burnt land and the whole damn bloodline, take 'em all," the auctioneer sneered. But no one answered. The crowd looked upon them like ghosts, something not of this world, something best left untouched. Then a gunshot cracked the silence. Crows scattered from the rooftops like black paper torn from the sky. A man stood in the center of the road, smoke still rising from the barrel of his gun. He stepped forward, dropped a single silver coin into the dirt and said, "They're mine, and if anyone thinks different, they won't see tomorrow's sun." No one dared breathe, for in that moment every soul on that land knew. He didn't just buy them. He bought fate. Silas Monroe lived alone, though he'd never used the word lonely. Not until a child's small hand touched his without asking. Morning had not yet broken. A faint brush of dawn, like pale powder, traced the ash-colored horizon. A hush of wind slipped beneath the warped
Wooden door, rustling the threadbare curtain draped over the window pane, its frayed edges like the seams of time unraveling, impossible to mend. Silas sat up in his creaking wooden bed, no clock, no voice to wake him. He'd risen at the same hour for near a decade, since the warmth of another soul last stirred inside that house. He stretched slow, his back cracking like old pine, then set bare feet onto a floor as cold and silent as stone. The small kitchen opened before him like a faded photograph. The coffee pot was dented, the porcelain cup chipped, and the sugar jar held only a crust at the bottom. He poured water, stacked thin twigs in the stove, and struck a match. The scent of overburnt coffee rose, a bitter tang like every other morning. But he didn't pour it out. He drank, winced, drank again, not for taste, but because it was the one thing that hadn't changed. A horse neighed from the stable. The gate creaked in the breeze. He pulled on a worn leather coat, the shoulder seams thinned with years, fastened a cuff with no button, slid into cracked boots, and stepped out to the porch. Morning wind swept through the dry valley, lifting dust and splintered cactus leaves. Silas passed a waist-high patch of dried grass where a wooden swing once hung. It had broken during the storm 3 years back. He hadn't removed it, perhaps because he wasn't ready to let it go. At the back fence line, 2 flat mounds of earth, one large, one small, marked with plain wooden stakes, no names. Low grass grew around them. A few withered daisies still clung to the dirt. Silas took a hoe, bent down, cleared the edges of the grass, then stood in silence. No prayer, no words, only a bowed head, his way of reminding himself that someone still lived within him. He returned indoors as the light began to swell. A mirror on the wall cast back a weather-worn face, gray whiskers tangled, eyes long, resigned. He brushed his hair behind one ear, a habit once done for him by the woman he lost. Now doing it himself, his hand paused a moment at the ear, as if reaching for the memory of her touch. Before heading out to check the fence line, he stopped. His hand flicked the switch of the oil lamp hanging by the porch. Though morning had come, though no one remembered the road back, he lit it every night. Not to guide someone home, but because deep down he still believed some shape in the distance might stop at this rusted gate. No one had called his name in a long while, and perhaps, just perhaps, he too had forgotten how it sounded when spoken by someone else. Up in the attic of the old house, where the tin roof, browned with rust, rattled each time the wind changed course, a small wooden chest sat beneath a low beam. No lock, no name, just coarse rope wound tightly around it, as if binding something that should not be let go. Silas climbed the attic ladder. Its brittle rungs creaked beneath the weight of worn-out boots. He didn't come up here often,
only on the days when the season turned, when the air carried a certain chill, when the north wind returned with the echoes of years that had already passed. The chest opened with a long, dry groan. Inside were letters, most written on yellowed paper with torn edges, the ink blurred, as if the pages themselves had once been soaked in tears. None had addresses, none were sealed. They were never meant to be sent, only kept, like the thoughts one never dares to speak aloud. Silas picked one from near the bottom. The paper curled with age, but the handwriting was steady. Sure, neat, heartbreakingly familiar. If one day someone knocks on our door, would we dare open it? He read it slow, as though even his breath might smudge the ink. A question, once a shared joke between him and the wife he lost. Back when they were young, whenever the dog barked at night, she would tease, "Maybe that neighbor girl's knocking to marry you." And he'd always answer with a gravelly laugh, then shake his head. "Ain't no one coming back for a busted-up cowboy." Now there was no one left to ask, no one left to laugh. Silas slid to the floor, back resting against the wooden chest. A breeze slipped between the planks, brushing the back of his neck, carrying with it a scent both strange and familiar, like old laundry soap mixed with ash from a fire long cold. He took the letter, held its edge to the candle flame. It caught slow, then curled into light. Each word burned, vanished, not died. This wasn't the first time he'd burned a letter, but today his hand trembled. Not from regret, but because winter had come too early. It was only the start of September, and already the wind smelled gray. The sun rose late, and night stretched on like a crack that refused to close. When the flame finally died, he brushed the ash to the side. Before descending the attic stairs, Silas glanced once more at the chest. This time he didn't tie the rope. He simply closed the lid. Gently, as if there was nothing left that needed sealing away, or perhaps something coming soon that no longer needed to be kept out. Downstairs, the porch light still glowed faintly in the early day, late noon in Wesson's Hollow. No rain, but the sky hung heavy, like it was about to unleash something more than water. A crosswind blew through, carrying red dust and grit that slapped against a crooked wooden sign staked in the town square. Property liquidation. 17th Land Goods People. That last word wasn't a misprint. In this part of the world, when tax debts stacked up and fire took more than timber, everything became something to bid on, even a family not yet undone. Up on the western ridge, the charred skeleton of a house, once belonging to the Duvals, was now on the block, along with all remaining contents. And that content was a woman and 3 children. No birth certificates, no death notice for the husband. The county marked them as unclassified. The townsfolk called them trouble that walked on 2 legs. May Duval didn't raise her head when her name was called. She stood still in the dust-covered square, ash-gray dress stitched with patches, hair tied back with a strip of worn fabric. Her left hand rested behind the youngest child, a barefoot boy, toes caked in mud, eyes round as riverstone. The 2 older ones stood behind her, shoulder to shoulder, so thin their shadows couldn't cover one another, like sagging pickets after a storm, upright only because they leaned on each other. The auctioneer barked, his voice frayed by the wind. He spoke of the lands working well, but skipped past the part about the survivors. A shop owner joked, "Split the kids up, you'll fetch more." Another chimed in, "That girl's probably good in a kitchen. The 2 boys could go to the stables." The little one, "Hey, forget it." May said nothing. No protest, no plea. Just tightened her hand slightly on her youngest boy's shoulder. Her fingers trembled, barely, but the child stood still, like he already knew what it meant to have your family priced in pieces. A woman on the edge of the square whispered, Her husband's not declared dead yet. Maybe he's alive and just left her. Word is they weren't even properly wed. The murmur grew, but no one stepped forward. May wasn't the kind to beg. Her spine stayed straight, chin tipped as if she still had choices left. Only her eyes betrayed her. Quiet, distant, like every stare cast her way, left a thin layer of ash settling deeper in her chest. At the edge of the gathering, a man on horseback reined in. He wore a weathered leather coat, boots caked in red soil, gloves askew, not from cold, but habit. It was Silas Monroe, who had come only to see the old mule folks were talking about. But now he no longer looked at the mule. His gaze was fixed on the woman in the square, who didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't cry. She looked like the woman whose hand he once buried beneath the earth 10 years ago, who also never cried when the wind tore at her coat, who stood tall as if she knew if she ever fell, no one else would rise in her place. The wind kicked up again. Dust blew hard across the square. The youngest boy rubbed his eyes, burrowed against his mother's leg. The auctioneer chuckled through his teeth. No takers? The county will split 'em. Could hire 'em out one by one, or... He never finished that sentence. The steady clop of hooves cut through the murmur. Silas stepped down from his horse. Not fast, not grand, just because he couldn't stomach it any longer. Silas wasn't dressed for attention. His long wool coat was worn, its sleeves frayed at the cuffs. The brim of his hat sagged low, shielding his face from the wind and from the eyes of the curious. He stepped into the crowd, not fast, not certain, but each step silenced the murmurs. No one knew why he was there, because everyone knew Silas Monroe hadn't meddled in anyone's business since the day his wife and child were gone. He lived alone, like a kite with no string, a man who said 3 words a day and survived on burnt coffee and old salt meat. Yet here he stood, in the town square where helplessness was being auctioned off with a woman's dignity. And he didn't walk past. He stopped. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the child, Arlo, the barefoot boy whose cracked feet clung to the dirt. The boy stared back, no fear, but no trust either, just a quiet look that asked, "What are you standing here for?" The wind shrieked through the square. The auctioneer hesitated. A voice from the rear spat, "Old man Monroe's fixin' to marry the whole bunch, looks like." Laughter, a few chuckles, but they didn't last. The sound fell back on itself like a wave meeting stone. Silas didn't answer. He removed his glove, reached into his coat, and pulled out a small notebook, the kind with bent corners and a leather cover, cracked like old skin. Inside was a folded stack of cash, pressed flat between 2 blank pages. It was money he'd set aside to patch the cattle shed for winter, and some for fruit trees, the kind he never planted but always meant to when there was someone left to share the harvest. He placed the money into the auctioneer's hand without naming a price. He said only one thing, "I don't buy people in pieces." Silence swallowed the square. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The auctioneer thumbed through the bills, then looked up. "Not enough if you're pricing by the head, but if we count it as a bundled lot—" "I'm not haggling," Silas cut in. Not sharp, just final. "And throw in that old mule, too. I'm not keeping it." A few scoffed. Someone muttered, "Wholesale kindness scarcer than gold." Silas didn't turn. His eyes stayed on May. She still hadn't spoken. No thank you, no nod, no tears. But for the first time she looked him square in the face. Those eyes weren't soft. They were rough-hewn, like shaved stone. But behind them lay exhaustion in layers, like someone who's been treading cold water too long and is about to slip under. That woman didn't want saving. She only wanted not to be broken apart. And that was what Silas had just done. Not rescue, not redemption. Just stood beside them when there was no one else left to stand. There was nothing celebratory in the sight of a widowed woman and 3 children walking behind a man who barely spoke. No one saw them off as they left the square. No heads turned. Only dust rose, beaten up by wind and kicked along by the quiet footsteps of 4 trailing behind Silas Monroe, whose hand remained steady on the reins, as if nothing had changed that late afternoon. May carried her youngest, Arlo, in her arms. His clothes were damp from the knees up. He rested his head against her neck, eyes wide open, locked on the man ahead. He watched each step Silas took, steady even, never turning back, but never straying far enough to leave anyone behind. The 2 older children followed. They said nothing, asked nothing. The wagon groaned over dry ruts, its wooden wheels grinding on gravel, leaving behind faint clouds of dust on the road leading out of town. The sky was shifting to a dull orange-gray, quiet like the thoughts of those riding the cart. Not quite grief, but not hope either. Silas sat at the front, didn't glance back. Not because he didn't care, only because he didn't know where to look when no words could possibly be right. May sat in the middle, her patched dress slowly drying. Her arms held Arlo close, but her eyes were on the far plain, where a herd of cattle moved like drifting specks in a sea of grass. The road back to the ranch wasn't long, but for someone who'd lost the power to choose where they belonged, each turn of the wheel was another small surrender. And for someone who had never had the word companion spoken about him, each silent breath behind him felt like a promise. Don't let them hurt again. When the wagon stopped at the ranch gate, Silas got down first. The old wooden gate, thick with creeping vine, let out a low groan from its rusted hinge. 9 years without being opened, and now it swung wide for someone he'd never met. May climbed down next. She didn't wait to be invited, didn't lower her gaze. She simply carried Arlo through the gate, as if stopping might break something in her legs that would never heal again. The older children stepped off behind her, feet brushing against dry dirt. One stumbled on a stone, didn't cry, just gripped his brother's hand tighter. Silas crossed the porch steps. The wooden door creaked open, softly, as if the hinges themselves had longed to be useful again. Inside, the house wasn't warm. There was no scent of baking bread, no tablecloth, only bare timber walls, furniture coated in dust, and a hearth that hadn't known fire in a long time. But there were no chains, no locks, no signs warning anyone to stay small or be silent, only a space that didn't ask anyone to shrink in order to fit him. Silas turned to May, didn't offer his hand, didn't point the way. He just said quiet and low, "You can take the east room." Then he walked out back where the stables needed checking before night set in for good. May stood there a moment, then nodded. Didn't say thank you, but for the first time, a woman didn't have to bow her head when someone took her in, and that night, for the first time in many years, Silas opened the door to the front room, just to light a fire, not to warm himself, but so the quiet shapes inside would know they no longer had to wait outside in the cold dark. May didn't say thank you, not out of pride, and not because she didn't know exactly what had been given. It's just words like that, when spoken through a throat raw from cold and shame, feel like gravel clawing its way up the windpipe. The first morning at Monroe Ranch began in a strange, quiet way. No one knocked, no one called out to anyone. May woke to sunlight pushing through a thin curtain, a curtain she'd hung herself the night before, using rusted nails and an old bra strap, cut and knotted from the box of spare cloth in the storage room. The east room, Silas had called it that, held 2 narrow wooden beds, a mildewed wardrobe, and a groaning floorboard with every step. But the door locked from the inside, and in the corner, a small stove had enough kindling for a pot of warm water. She hadn't brought much, just 3 children's shirts, a torn wool scarf, and a one-eyed stuffed bear that Arlo still clung to in sleep, as if letting go would mean he'd vanish into the night. May lit the stove, washed the last 2 wooden bowls left in the main kitchen. She didn't ask to use them, didn't seek permission, just cleaned, set them on the drying rack, wiped down the counter. She didn't know how long they'd be allowed to stay, so everything she did with the soft hands of someone walking across thin ice. The children still said little. The oldest, Noah, helped pump water. The middle boy, Jonah, quietly sliced cornbread into smaller pieces, careful to make them even, and Arlo just kept looking around, as if trying to remember what trust might look like in a place like this. Outside, Silas had risen early. He checked the western fence line where the wind had battered hard last night. He asked no questions about the strangers now living in his home, didn't inspect the kitchen, didn't count his spoons. He knew if they weren't planning to stay, they wouldn't have wiped the windows. But this morning, the glass was clear. Heading back toward the stable, he saw May sweeping the yard. Her head bent low, dark brown hair tied back but frayed loose around her neck. The broom was made from old cholla branches. It whispered across the dirt like someone who'd learned to move through storms. Silas didn't stop. He only said, out of habit, "There's blankets in the wardrobe. East room." May didn't look up, but her reply came level, without gratitude, without resentment. "I don't owe you." Silas nodded, didn't look at her, didn't break stride. "I'm not collecting." That afternoon he set down a basket of firewood beside the porch, just close enough to the door to be seen. Didn't knock. Left no note. Just placed it there and went. May, instead of taking the wood, put something back in its place. A small cornbread loaf baked from the last bit of meal she found in the pantry. No one said a word, but here even kindness was returned by hand, never by mouth. That night Silas sat on the porch. The lantern cast a dim yellow glow. Crickets hummed beneath the cactus roots. He heard no voices from the house, just a sliver of light through the edge of the curtain and the faintest scent of soap riding on the breeze. No one said thank you that day, but no one left either. 3 days passed. No one knocked on any door. No one asked what someone else planned to do that day or tomorrow. Each did their part as if they were parallel shadows, not leaning, not colliding, but also not walking away. Silas rose early, same as always. Brewed coffee, this time with a steadier flame, because he used the smaller pot, not the old iron kettle. Not for anyone else, just because today it felt right to do it properly. He took the coffee out to the barn, tightened a loose chain on the rear gate. The sun hadn't yet climbed. Dew still clung to the fence line. When he returned to the porch and set his mug down on the chipped wooden table near the door, he saw it. A child's shirt, dust-faded brown, hung over the railing. No clothespin, no hook, held in place by a smooth round stone, lay gently atop its edge. The breeze tugged it, lifting a corner. Sunlight passed through the thin fabric, casting a quiet image that caught him just beneath the ribs. A family just passing through doesn't wash and hang up a child's shirt on the porch. Someone merely sheltering for the night doesn't hum as they do the wash. And sure enough, from the side of the house, through the cracked window pane, came a sound Silas hadn't heard in years. A woman's voice, singing low, no words clear. Some old folk tune with a lilt from somewhere else, maybe French, maybe near the Louisiana border. Not sad, not cheerful, just the kind of song someone hums while wringing out sleeves or wiping down a table. Silas didn't step inside, didn't call out. He simply stood behind the outer barn wall, listening through the chorus. Not because of the melody, but because that voice wasn't singing to anyone. Not a thank you, not a performance, just a breath that had music in it. And in that moment, he no longer felt the cold wind slip through his coat. Not because the day had warmed, but because something inside him, something hollow, had been filled with something small and soft. That evening he came home a little earlier than usual, said nothing, but as he passed the porch he noticed the shirt was dry. The little stone still held the edge in place, and next to it, a pair of tiny socks, darned at the heels with thread in a mismatched color. This house, for the first time in many years, had someone living in it, not taking shelter, not asking, just living. Arlo, the youngest, still hadn't spoken a word. Since arriving at the ranch, the boy had clung to his mother, eaten little, slept less, and seemed to listen more than most children look, though his eyes rarely left the ground. But that morning, as Silas carried out a box of nails to fix the porch step, he heard the soft patter of small footsteps behind him. Light, short, but unmistakable to a man who'd lived 10 years, knowing only the rhythm of his own breath. Another presence. He didn't turn, didn't ask. He simply lined a nail into the groove of the warped wood and tapped it in, with a short-handled hammer, careful, measured strokes. Arlo sat down exactly 3 paces away, said nothing, didn't fidget, just sat, arms wrapped around his knees, watching every motion. Silas pretended not to notice, but his hands moved slower, as if trying to make the hammer's thud soft enough not to startle. They sat that way nearly half an hour. Arlo didn't leave, and when Silas finally stood to take the tools back inside, the boy stood too, still silent, still asking for nothing. That afternoon, as Silas led the cattle out toward the southern pasture, Arlo followed again, this time with a dry branch in hand, not to play with but to use as a walking stick, nudging stones from his path, quiet but matching step for step. May saw it, but she didn't call him back. She stood behind the window frame, a drying rag in hand, not wiping any more, just watching, silent, still, because she understood. Arlo didn't attach to people easily, and if he had chosen silence, then a man who spoke little was the safest place to put it. The next day, when Silas was fixing the water trough behind the storage shed, Arlo followed once more. Still no questions, just stood, then sat, then reached out, asking with a look for the small pipe wrench. Silas handed it over. Didn't speak. That evening, as he unloaded apples from the wagon, Silas pulled out one small fruit, cut it in half, then sliced it further into thin pieces with a dull knife, the kind he used more for carving wood than food. He handed one to Arlo. The boy took it, bit in, and smiled. Not wide, not bright, just a quiet lift at the corner of his mouth, like a nod, spoken with the face instead of words. And Silas, for the first time, looked directly at him, not out of curiosity, but because he felt, deep in the silence, that he'd just been greeted. Dusk fell. Silas sat on the porch step, knife in hand, still slicing apples into thin slivers. Arlo sat beside him, feet still, holding a slice in both hands, chewing slow. They didn't speak, but if a stranger had passed by the gate just then, they might have said, "Those two have been living together for years." Light rain began falling in the late afternoon, the kind of rain the drylands get, brief, soft, but just enough to cool the earth and stir the scent of wild grass. Oh, into the wind. May lit the stove early. She sliced cornbread, reheated yesterday's black beans. The wood burner whispered its low crackles, like someone exhaling gently beneath warm blankets. The 3 children sat quietly around the square wooden table, its corners worn smooth by time. They polished the spoons and forks with scraps of cloth, their small hands working with quiet purpose. Silas didn't say anything when he came in. He set down a bundle of dry kindling in the corner, then took his usual seat near the door. the same place where he'd sipped his coffee for years before anyone else lived under that roof. They didn't wait for each other, but no one ate before the rest. Dinner began as it had every other night, portions divided, quiet chewing, the older ones helping the younger. May didn't eat right away. She poured water, wiped Arlo's mouth, then finally took her first bite. The silence was familiar, but tonight something shifted. The middle child, Jonah, tried to pour more water into his brother's cup. His hand caught the edge of the bowl. Water splashed across the table, some onto May's shirt, some onto the floor. Everyone froze. In another place, in another life, that child might have been scolded. In a past they hadn't left far behind, maybe even struck. But May just looked at him and laughed. Not loud, just a breath turned into sound, tired but soft. Silas glanced up. He didn't smile, but something in his gaze eased. Jonah, expecting anger, blinked, then smiled too, as if that laugh had unfastened something tightly knotted in his chest. The whole kitchen felt warmer then, not from the stove, but from the echo of that laugh in a room that had grown used to nothing but wind and cold plank walls. Arlo didn't understand the joke, but his brother was smiling. His mother was smiling, so he smiled too. Small mouth lifting, spoon still clutched in his fist. Silas rose, slowly, and poured more water from the iron kettle. No one asked him to. No one thanked him, but everyone saw it. Tonight he sat at the table, not as a host, not as an outsider, just a place at the table. A steady seat for someone come home after a long, long day, when there was only one piece of cornbread left on the plate. No one reached for it. May looked at the children. They looked at each other. Then Noah slid the plate toward Silas. He didn't eat it. He simply broke the bread in two, set half on Arlo's plate, the other on Jonah's. Didn't look up. Didn't wait for thanks. That night, May washed the dishes with one hand and wiped tears with the other. No one saw, but if someone had walked past the kitchen just then, they'd have smelled a hint of burnt cornbread and heard something that sounded an awful lot like happiness. The wind had turned cold, that sharp highland kind of cold, dry and blade-like, the sort that slides down your collar and makes your shoulders hunch before you even know it. Silas was tying down the tarp over the barn eaves, a corner having come loose from last night's wind. He knelt on one knee, hands pulling rope, eyes fixed on a worn wooden hook. His ankle throbbed again, the old pain from a fall long ago, but he didn't pause. One section of rope needed replacing, he noted. The wind kept threading down his neck, settling its chill like dust behind the bones. Then he heard it. Small footsteps. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, like the deep breath a day takes before ending. It was Arlo again. The boy held a thin slice of apple in both hands. It was cut too jagged to be an adult's work, clearly carved by Arlo himself with that dull old knife Silas had handed him days before. He didn't speak at first, just stepped close, hand outstretched, the apple slice resting in his sun-darkened palm. Silas didn't reach for it. He simply looked up. And just then, Arlo spoke, one word, "Pa." Not a call, not a plea, not testing the waters, just said it, like something he'd carried too long in the quiet hollows of his chest. Silas didn't answer, didn't turn. His hands only gripped the rope tighter, pulled the knot once more, slower than needed. The wind still bit, but something warmer had passed through him. Not the apple, not a smile, just a word. The shortest he'd ever heard, and the longest it had taken to reach his ears. Arlo didn't wait. He laid the apple slice on the wood beside him and walked back toward the house. His back, this time, didn't curve with weight. Silas sat there a long while. The tarp flapped above him, dust gathering around his boots. His hand held the rope still, but his eyes stayed dry. Still, not the stillness of loneliness, but the kind that follows when someone, just once, calls you their anchor. That night he made coffee, same as always. Only this time, it didn't burn. For the first time in years, he'd gotten the water just right. May, in the kitchen, saw steam rising from the old enamel cup. She heard the quiet clink of a spoon stirring. She didn't ask, didn't speak. She simply smiled, as if she knew that something vast had happened that day, something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. A week had passed since Arlo called Silas that one word. Then came the sound, wagon wheels rattling over the dirt road that led into Monroe Ranch. Silas was cutting grass behind the barn when he heard it. That crunch of iron on gravel, the kind that didn't belong to someone walking and sure wasn't hauling feed. He looked up, scythe still in hand, squinting toward the gate. A mud-brown wagon stood there now, dust clinging to its frame, but the metal plate on its side was still legible through, the grime. Marlowe County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Graham stepped down, sturdy built, early 50s wide-brimmed hat, and leather belt slung with quiet authority. He didn't reach for his papers right away, just pulled off his gloves, gave Silas a slow nod, like men who've known of each other more than they've spoken, and said just loud enough not to lose to the wind, "County wants to re-verify the legal status of the kids and Mrs. Duval." Silas didn't respond. He wiped his brow with the cuff of his shirt, then drove the scythe blade into the soil and stood up straight. Graham wasn't a cruel man, but he was a man of lines and ledgers, sent to carry out what others decided without ever walking the land. They're saying, if her husband's still alive, you could be charged with unlawful harboring, and the kids, no birth records, no guardianship proof. Silas didn't argue, didn't shrug, just looked at him, like one might look at the final frost of winter, not with fear, but with the patience of someone who's outlasted colder things. Then May appeared. No one called her. She just came, her dress patched again at the hip, a wooden spoon still in hand, halfway through stirring a pot of morning porridge. Her face wasn't scared, but it was wide awake. The sheriff turned to her. Something flickered in him, hesitation maybe, not because of the law, but because of the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to lose and yet stood without trembling. You know, this could turn serious. May nodded, didn't flinch, and spoke, her voice calm and deep, like water drawn from an old stone well. "I won't leave my children, even if I have to go back to the fire." The sheriff dropped his gaze. No one asked what the fire meant. No one had to. Wind swept through the willows behind the house. Golden leaves spun down in slow spirals. A cow exhaled from somewhere in the field, as if reminding the world to breathe. Finally, Graham slid the papers back into his coat, didn't add a word, just nodded to May, deeper than the nod he'd given Silas, then climbed back onto the wagon. The wheels groaned against the earth, pulling away with a sound like something fragile being torn from quiet. Silas didn't speak, neither did May. They stood side by side, a man who'd buried a home, a woman once listed with property and livestock. No oaths, no promises, only a shared knowing. From now on, every day would need to be lived more carefully, but also more firmly. That night, May didn't lock the door, not because she forgot, but because, if trouble came, they'd face it together. Night fell slowly. Clouds crept in from the east, thick, heavy. The scent of earth rose off the canyon walls. Not the kind that teases rain, but the kind that says, it's staying the night. The hearth fire crackled inside the house. May had finished the dishes early, but hadn't gone upstairs. She sat quietly by the stove, gathering the pile of torn clothing. A few old dresses, some shirts with unraveling seams. and began stitching under the low kitchen light. The needle trembled in her hand, not from cold, but because her heart hadn't settled since the sheriff's wagon showed up that morning. The feeling of being watched, judged, weighed like spoiled fruit on a scale. It didn't shout, but it lingered, like rot beneath the roots of something trying to grow. Outside, the rain began, not hard, but steady, tapping on the tin roof, slipping through the leaves, streaking the wooden window panes with wandering trails. Silas woke to the sound of it. He didn't turn on a light, just pulled on a coat, stepped into the boots by the back door, still crusted with mud, and made his way to the kitchen. The lantern was still lit. May sat with her back to him, leaned against the doorframe, hands folded around fabric in her lap. She wasn't sewing anymore, just sitting there, still between the hush of rain and the soft sound of a dropped needle hitting wood. Silas said nothing. He reached for the thin wool blanket folded over the back of a chair, walked over, and laid it gently across her shoulders. May didn't turn, didn't flinch. She only nodded, a nod like a sigh, like saying, "I'm still here." They didn't look at each other, just stayed there. One standing, one sitting in a warm wooden kitchen with the storm outside stretching on. No one needed anything from the other. No one had to prove they mattered. But in that moment, as clear as the rain tapping the roof, one truth stood tall. No one should sit alone on a night like this. In time, Silas sat beside her, not close, not far, just enough that if either were to lean, a shoulder would find another. They didn't lean, but they didn't leave either. Outside, the rain fell like a quiet confession from the sky. Inside, warm yellow light touched their faces. Not lovers, not husband and wife, not bound by name or vow. Just two souls who had survived too many winters to believe in anything hurried. That night, the wooden house was left unlocked. It didn't need to be, because the rain was loud enough to soothe even the oldest wounds back to sleep, and the warmth was close enough for someone to sit and stay a while without fearing they were a burden. Sunlight returned after the night's rain. Morning mist stretched like silk across the tall hill grass. Cattle bellowed across the pasture, and a lone black crow landed on the fence line, its hoarse cry marking the start of another day. May stepped onto the porch, carrying Arlo. He clung to her neck, hair still damp with sleep. A red mark from a sewing needle lingered on her wrist. She stood for a moment, waiting, as if letting the sunlight touch her shoulder made it real, then turned and went back inside. In the front hall, Noah, the oldest, stood reading the faded sign propped near the gate. Monroe Ranch. The board was half rotted, the E tilting like it might fall at any moment. May picked up a stub of white chalk, the last remnant from a street vendor's crate years ago, and began teaching Noah to sound out each letter one by one, not to teach him school, but because if a child could read the name of a place, maybe he could believe he belonged to it. Jonah, the middle boy, had followed Silas out early. He didn't ask questions. He simply carried a small wooden mallet and trailed behind to the west side of the house, where a door had long groaned loose on its hinges, flapping in every night wind. Silas didn't give instructions, didn't teach, but when he lifted his hammer, Jonah reached up and held the nail steady with his own fingers. No one called it helping, it was just being near. Arlo was different. The smallest of them, he still shadowed Silas like a second bootstep, but today he wandered to the apple shed alone, retrieved the dull knife Silas had once handed him, and sliced the first ripe apple of the season. He didn't eat it, just wiped it clean, cut it into careful wedges, just like Silas used to, and laid them out on the lid of an old tin barrel, as if offering it to the whole house. May saw all of it. She didn't call to them, didn't praise, didn't say how good they were, She just stood on the porch watching her 3 children doing 3 different things. And Silas standing nearby, bucket in hand, as though he'd always been there. Evening came. Sunlight slipped off the kitchen door. The children finished supper, climbed the stairs, and laid side by side, uncoaxed, uncalled. From below, Silas watched their limbs tangle in sleep. 3 small arms draped over one another. They didn't ask where they'd go tomorrow, didn't ask if they'd be driven off again. They just slept. And for the first time, no one left the lamp burning. Outside, the wind moved sideways. An owl called from somewhere out in the hills. Inside, a small oil lamp cast golden light against the wall. Silas didn't brew coffee. May didn't mend clothes. Only the coals cracked softly in the stove, and a quiet warmth settled somewhere deep in the bones. No one in that house had papers, no titles, no promises, but each person had a task, not out of duty, but because something had begun to root, a home, not anchored in law, but built by small hands and a heart too scarred to lie about what was finally quietly real. Sunlight returned after the night's rain. Morning mist stretched like silk across the tall hill grass. Cattle bellowed across the pasture, and a lone black crow landed on the fence line, its hoarse cry marking the start of another day. May stepped onto the porch, carrying Arlo. He clung to her neck, hair still damp with sleep. A red mark from a sewing needle lingered on her wrist. She stood for a moment, waiting, as if letting the sunlight touch her shoulder made it real, then turned and went back inside. In the front hall, Noah, the oldest, stood reading the faded sign propped near the gate, Monroe Ranch. The board was half rotted, the E tilting like it might fall at any moment. May picked up a stub of white chalk, the last remnant from a street vendor's crate years ago, and began teaching Noah to sound out each letter, one by one. Not to teach him school, but because if a child could read the name of a place, maybe he could believe he belonged to it. Jonah, the middle boy, had followed Silas out early. He didn't ask questions. He simply carried a small wooden mallet and trailed behind to the west side of the house, where a door had long groaned loose on its hinges, flapping in every night wind. Silas didn't give instructions, didn't teach. But when he lifted his hammer, Jonah reached up and held the nail steady with his own fingers. No one called it helping. It was just being near. Arlo was different, the smallest of them. He still shadowed Silas like a second bootstep. But today he wandered to the apple shed alone, retrieved the dull knife Silas had once handed him, and sliced the first ripe apple of the season. He didn't eat it, just wiped it clean, cut it into careful wedges, just like Silas used to, and laid them out on the lid of an old tin barrel, as if offering it to the whole house. May saw all of it. She didn't call to them, didn't praise, didn't say how good they were. She just stood on the porch, watching her 3 children doing 3 different things, and Silas standing nearby, bucket in hand, as though he'd always been there. Evening came. Sunlight slipped off the kitchen door. The children finished supper, climbed the stairs, and laid side by side, uncoaxed, uncalled. From below, Silas watched their limbs tangle in sleep, 3 small arms draped over one another. They didn't ask where they'd go tomorrow, didn't ask if they'd be driven off again. They just slept. And for the first time, no one left the lamp burning. Outside, the wind moved sideways. An owl called from somewhere out in the hills. Inside, a small oil lamp cast golden light against the wall. Silas didn't brew coffee. May didn't mend clothes. Only the coals cracked softly in the stove, and a quiet warmth settled somewhere deep in the bones. No one in that house had papers, no titles, no promises, but each person had a task, not out of duty, but because something had begun to root, a home, not anchored in law. but built by small hands and a heart too scarred to lie about what was finally, quietly, real. Early morning, the dew still clung to the tallest blades of grass. Sunlight had just begun to step softly through the trees to the east. A thin light, delicate as thread, just enough to tell where the house ended and where the mist lingered on the window panes. Silas made coffee early, not because he'd been woken, but because this morning, for once, he didn't feel the need to stay in bed a moment longer. He stood on the porch, steam curling up from the mug in his hand, watching the chickens scratch beneath the birch. The ground was still damp from the storm 2 nights back. It was an ordinary day, and perhaps that's what made it feel rare. The door creaked open. Arlo came and sat beside him, silent, cradling a tin cup of milk in both hands. The enamel chipped, the rim cracked, but he held it like it meant something. Silas said nothing, just glanced sideways, then looked away again, not out of awkwardness, but because sometimes even a glance can break something tender. Behind them, May stepped out, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. Same old dress, but clean and pressed. She stood behind Silas for a long time, saying nothing. Only when he began to turn did she speak, quiet but clear. No one told him to call you Pa. But if that's what he's chosen, I won't stop it. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked down at his cup. The steam still rose, slow, steady. Then he stepped aside, poured another mug, and set it down next to Arlo's milk. No nod, no vow, just the smallest act to speak the biggest truth. I'm here, if you want to stay. May didn't reach for the cup right away. She watched the steam lift into the pale blue sky. A sky with no birds, only wind passing beneath the patched eaves. The breeze was still sharp, the kind that slips down the back of your neck, makes you shiver just enough to know the season's turning. But the wooden door behind them remained open. Not because anyone forgot, but because maybe it didn't need closing anymore, and so without paper, without rings, without spoken vows, they began to live as a family truly lives, where every quiet act was a stitch pulled through hearts that had been torn too long to trust anything hurried. No promises, only presence, and that was enough.